My name is Diana Calloway. I am 34 years old, and I have lived on Dalton Street for 6 years, long enough to know which neighbors leave their porch lights on, which ones take their bins out on Wednesday nights, and which ones will absolutely hear every word spoken at a normal volume from a front doorstep. My husband Marcus knew this too. That was why he chose the front porch. That was why he chose 7 in the evening. He wanted the street to see. I want to go back to the beginning, because the ending only makes sense if you understand how quietly the beginning unfolded. Marcus and I met when I was 27. He was 32, working in sales for a logistics company, charming in the way that takes a few years to fully read. He was generous early on, attentive, the kind of man who remembered your coffee order and showed up with it unannounced on a difficult Tuesday. I was working as a property contracts administrator for a mid-sized real estate firm, and I had been in that role long enough to understand paperwork, ownership, and exactly what a signature meant on a legal document. We dated for 2 years before he proposed. The wedding was small, honest, genuinely happy. I believed all of it. What I also knew, and what I was careful about from the beginning, was that Marcus had a complicated financial history. Not criminal, not malicious, just years of poor decisions made young. Missed payments, 2 defaults, a credit score that had been climbing slowly back toward acceptable for the better part of a decade. When we decided to buy a house together in year 3 of our marriage, every lender we approached reached the same conclusion. The mortgage would need to be in my name alone. His history made joint approval impossible at any rate that made sense. Marcus agreed immediately. He said it didn't matter whose name was on the document. He said we were a team. He said that kind of thing convincingly. The house on Dalton Street cost $412,000. The mortgage was approved in my name. I signed every document. I have kept copies of all of them in a fireproof box in the back of my wardrobe since the day we moved in. The first 3 years in that house were ordinary in the way that married life often is. A mix of good months and difficult ones, renovation arguments and holiday disagreements, and the slow accumulation of small disappointments that you file away without examining too closely. Marcus got a promotion. I changed firms. We talked about children without ever quite deciding. We planted a garden in the front that I maintained almost entirely alone, but that Marcus was happy to mention at dinner parties as something we had done together. By year 5, I had started noticing things I did not want to name. He came home later. He was present but absent, sitting in the same room while clearly being somewhere else entirely. He stopped asking about my work. He started taking calls in the garage with the door pulled shut. I am not a dramatic person. I do not catastrophize. I told myself it was a difficult period, and that difficult periods end. What ended instead was the marriage. I found out the way people usually find out, not through anything dramatic or cinematic, but through something small and accidental. A notification that appeared on a shared tablet we used for grocery lists. A name I did not recognize attached to a message I was not meant to see. I did not confront him that night. I went to bed, lay still in the dark, and began thinking very clearly. I spent the next 3 months being methodical. I am good at paperwork. I understand documentation. I spoke to a solicitor quietly, told no one, and began organizing everything that belonged to me. I moved a portion of my savings into an account he had no access to. I located every document that mattered. I was not planning revenge. I was planning clarity. Marcus, during those same 3 months, was planning something different. He had apparently decided that the most efficient path forward was to simply remove me from the house and present that as a conclusion. He had told several people, I learned later, that he was going to ask me to leave. He had described this to at least one friend as taking back control. On the Thursday evening when it happened, I had come home from work to find 2 of our neighbors' cars in the street and Mrs. Peterson deadheading her roses, which she does at the same time every week without fail. Marcus was in the living room. He had changed out of his work clothes, which I noticed because he almost never did that before dinner. He had the look of a man who had rehearsed something. He told me the marriage was over. I said I agreed. He told me he wanted me out of the house. I did not respond to that part. He interpreted my silence as shock and continued talking, his voice getting louder, more certain of itself. Then he picked up the small overnight bag I use for work trips, which had been sitting by the stairs, walked to the front door, opened it, and placed it on the porch. He gestured at the doorway in a manner I can only describe as theatrical, and said, loud enough for the open street to absorb every syllable, that he wanted me out by tonight, that I should take what was mine and go. Mrs. Peterson's hand paused on her roses. I looked at the bag on the porch. I looked at my husband. I looked at the house behind him. I picked up the bag, carried it back inside, and set it at the foot of the stairs. He stared at me. I walked to the kitchen, filled a glass with water, and turned to face him. My voice was the same temperature it always is when I am most certain about something. You have 30 days to vacate my property, I said. He laughed. A short, disbelieving sound. Your property. The mortgage is in my name, I said. The deed is in my name. It has been since the day we bought it. You will need to find alternative accommodation. I would suggest starting that process this week. He stopped laughing. I drank my water and went upstairs. The days that followed were not simple, but they were straightforward in the way that things become when the most complicated part is already decided. Marcus cycled through several phases in quick succession. First came the argument that he had contributed to the household financially for years, and that this entitled him to a share of the property. It did not. His name was on no document. He had signed no agreement granting him interest, and his financial contributions to a household he had lived in did not create legal ownership. My solicitor confirmed this in writing. Then came the appeal to sentiment. He reminded me of the garden, the holidays, the early years. I listened to all of it. None of it changed the legal reality of whose name was on the deed. Then came the suggestion that I was being vindictive, that a reasonable person would allow him to stay while things were sorted out, that throwing him out was an act of cruelty. I reminded him, calmly, that he had placed my bag on the front porch in front of 6 neighbors and told me to leave. I was simply clarifying who actually had the authority to make that request. On the 4th day, he called his brother, who called my sister-in-law, who called me to suggest I was being unreasonable. I told her I was following the law and ended the call politely. On the 7th day, Marcus retained a solicitor of his own. On the 14th, his solicitor wrote to mine with a claim that Marcus had made substantial improvements to the property during the marriage and was therefore entitled to a portion of its value. My solicitor and I had anticipated this. I had kept records, receipts for work completed during the marriage, documentation of who had commissioned it, bank statements showing which account the payments had come from. In every case, the money had come from my account or from a joint account to which I had contributed the larger share. The improvements argument was not impossible to make, but it was weak, and Marcus's solicitor appears to have understood this once the documentation was presented. On the 22nd day, Marcus moved his belongings out with the help of his brother and a hired van. I stayed upstairs until they were done, not out of hostility, simply because there was nothing useful I could contribute to that process, and I had a report due. Mrs. Peterson knocked on my door that evening with a casserole dish covered in foil. She said she had heard some of what happened on the porch, and that she had always thought the garden looked better when I was tending it. Then she handed me the dish and went back to her roses. I sat at the kitchen table and ate alone, and felt something I had not expected to feel, which was not triumph, not sadness, but a very quiet and complete kind of relief. The house was mine. It had always been mine. The piece of paper in my fireproof box had simply been waiting to mean what it already said. The divorce was finalized 4 months later. Marcus was entitled to a small portion of the value accumulated during the marriage from the joint account, which my solicitor negotiated down to a fair number and which I paid in a single transfer. He signed the final papers on a Monday morning. I was at work when it happened. My solicitor sent me a message. I replied with a thank you and went back to my spreadsheet. I still live on Dalton Street. The garden is in better shape than it has ever been. I replanted the front beds last spring with something that needs less maintenance and looks better for longer, which felt, when I was doing it, like an appropriate metaphor that I did not say out loud to anyone. There are things I understand now that I did not fully understand before. One of them is that documentation is not distrust. Keeping records of what belongs to you is not a cynical act. It is clarity, and clarity is not cold. It is simply honest. Another is that the moment someone tries to humiliate you publicly is rarely the beginning of the story. It is almost always the moment they overplayed a hand they had been holding for much longer. Marcus thought the front porch was his strongest move. He thought visibility would work in his favor, that a street full of witnesses would make me feel small enough to simply go. What he had not accounted for was that I had spent 3 months being very quiet and very prepared, and that the witnesses on Dalton Street were watching the same scene he was, but arriving at a completely different conclusion. The people who try to remove you from rooms you built rarely understand what you had to do to build them. They see the result and assume ownership. They do not see the paperwork, the nights, the decisions made carefully and without announcement. I saw it. I kept the copies. And when the moment came, I did not need to raise my voice. The house on Dalton Street is mine. The deed says so. It always did. Some things only become visible when someone foolish enough to ignore them forces the question into the open. I finished the casserole Mrs. Peterson brought me. I washed the dish and returned it the next morning with a small bunch of flowers from the front garden. She seemed pleased. Life on Dalton Street continues. I take my bins out on Wednesday nights, keep the porch light on, and tend the garden on weekend mornings when the light is good. Some spaces, once clarified, stay that way.